Dr. Patti Ralabate here with us to present on reaching all learners with culturally responsive design. Dr. Patti Ralabate is the author of Your UDL Lesson Planner, the step-by-step guide to teaching all learners, and the co-author of Culturally Responsive Design, and is in the press. After completing a Boston College UDL postdoctoral fellowship, she served as the CAS Director of Implementation, National Center on UDL Director, and Director of the Gates-funded UDL PDS project focused on developing district-wide UDL implementation systems. Building on 25 years of experience as a speech and language pathologist and 9 years as the National Education Association Senior Policy Analyst for Special and Gifted Education, she currently teaches courses for CAS and the George Washington University. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us, Doctor.
Thank you, Ellie. And good morning, good Friday morning. Thank you all for being here so early. Thank you and hello to people in virtual land. I will try to remember you as we're going through our various exercises this morning and our content. I like to start with goals, learner goals. I think it's important to start with learner goals for all lessons, and you'll see that within my book and within everything that I say to you this morning. So these are two of the learner objectives or outcomes that I defined for this session when I sent in my proposal. One is that you be able by the end of this morning to describe at least 3 ways that our students demonstrate cultural response, let me start that over again, okay? That you'll be able to describe at least 3 ways to create culturally responsive UDL-infused lessons. And the second one being that you will be able to identify at least 2 UDL strategies that support language development for English learners. I should read it from the beginning so that I don't make it up. And those are 2 that I thought we should make sure you're able to do by the time you leave today. What I think is really important is that you look at that and you think about why you came to this session. And you design your own personal learning goal for this morning. Just reflect on that for a minute. If you would like to write it down on the notes that are available in the app or on an index card that's available at your table. Those of you in virtual land, if you have a way of writing it down or so that you can remember it, and then we're going to share it with other people in the room. So just take a moment and reflect on what it is that you want to be able to do by 10 o'clock this morning. Okay. I see that people are still writing, but I'm going to give you directions for what we're going to do with that content. I'm going to ask you to come up here and to line up in a line of 2. One person on this side, one person on that side. One person facing the windows that way, one person facing the wall that way, okay? And we're going to start our line and make an L over this way and down that way, so that everybody is in line facing one person. And if you would do that quickly, come on up.
So like I'm facing a person standing here?
You're facing a person standing here.
So look this
Yep,
way?
yep,
Okay,
and the person there.
Found my person.
Yep,
Sorry.
yep, another person here.
Totally get it, but
Okay? All right. Great, great, great. Good work. Okay. All right. All right. And those of you in virtual land, if you could do a very similar kind of thing, find up here a partner And someone directly across from you here. And then maybe we can start. Yeah, that's good. And then the line could start right. Kristen, if you could move over this way so that we can. Yeah, that's it. All right, all the way. Everybody got a partner? Okay. So I'd like to give you directions. You're far more verbal for a group on Friday morning than I expected. You saw what you're supposed to do and you jumped right in. I love it. Okay, so please share your name, where you work, and what your personal goal is. And if you have enough time, share with the other person something that is really good that happened to you recently. Go. Okay. Verbal group. Okay. Okay. Thank you. We're going to have a choral response help us to organize ourselves so that I don't have to raise my voice and you get a chance to finish your thought before we move on to the next thing. So each time we do a share like this, I'm going to say, look at me, and you're going to say, 1, 2, 3. Okay? Let's try it once. Look at me.
1, 2, 3.
Oh, you're good. Okay. Please go back to your places. So did you find some personal goals that were similar to yours? I hope. And maybe a few that were very different. That would be great. One other sort of housekeeping thing that we're going to talk about is you'll see at every table here you have a large chart paper, large piece of chart paper. At different points this morning, I'm going to ask you to add to that. We're going to create jointly a concept map of the different concepts and points that we talk about this morning. And you can do that individually. One of you can say, I got this one. You guys can do that one. Or you can do it as a group. There are 2 for the larger tables so that you can split into groups of 2 or 3 and create the concept map together. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, so let's start first with a little fist of 5. How many of you would say that on a scale of 0 to 5 that you feel very comfortable with the framework of culturally responsive teaching? 0 being, never really heard about it before, and that's why I came this morning. Or 5 being, I use it all the time, I'm familiar with it, in fact, I teach other people about it. So somewhere between 0 and 5, where are you in terms of the understanding the concept of culturally responsive teaching? Okay, and just put those up, okay? Great. All right, so we have most people who are really here to learn more about that. That's great. How about the concept of universal design for learning, the conceptual framework? 0 to 5, a lot of people, okay, there's a number of 5s here, people who actually teach about it, 4s who apply it in their lessons and classrooms already, and then we do have a few people who are 1s. I don't see any 0s yet. Okay, so for those of you who are at the 5s and 4s, bear with me if I spend a little more time on explaining what UDL is than you might need, because we do have some people in the room who feel that they really want to know more about it. Okay? All righty. Let's see. Oh, let's meet Lee. Lee is an experienced teacher. She's been teaching for 15 years. She knows her content. She feels that she's a very effective teacher. But recently, her classroom has changed. The students coming to her classroom are now much more diverse than they used to be. She's got more than 40 languages represented in her school, and she really doesn't feel prepared. So even though she's an experienced teacher, she doesn't really feel prepared to address the needs of her students as well as she could before. That might relate to your description of yourself. Culturally responsive teaching is a framework that would help her. And culturally responsive teaching is described by a variety of authors, and all of them have outlined different principles or aspects of culturally responsive teaching. You can kind of go blind trying to sort it all out, frankly. But the one that most people go to is Geneva Gay's definition that I have up here on the slide, and that is that culturally responsive teaching is really using the cultural knowledge of your students, their experiences, their prior experiences, their frames of reference, and their performance styles, and using that information as you plan, as you teach, as you incorporate that into your practice. What we found when we decided to write this book, Culturally Responsive Design for English Learners, the UDL Approach for CAST, my co-author, Louis Lord Nelson, and I found that there were so many different definitions and aspects out there of culturally responsive teaching that we needed one frame to be able to use as a reference point. And so we went to Brown University's description. And those of you who have pulled off the notes, you'll see that this is described in the notes for you as well, so that you don't have to take copious notes yourself. But what Brown University did was they identified 7 principles under culturally responsive teaching. Positive perspectives on parents and families, communication with families and the community of high expectations for all learners, learning within the context of culture, using student-centered instruction, using culturally mediated instruction, which we'll explain in a minute, reshaping the curriculum based on the culture and experiences of the students that you have, and the teacher acting more as a facilitator and guide of learning rather than a disseminator of learning. I want you to take a moment, and I'm going to put those principles back up on the board again for you on the slides. But want you to, with a partner at the table, and hopefully in virtual land you can do the same, pick one of the characteristics that are going to be on the following slide, and think about it and talk about it with your partner, and name it 1 to 3 indicators that your practice, your instruction is actually meeting the aspect of that particular characteristic. Okay. Does that make sense? You're going to go ahead. What would you be doing? What would be an indicator? If somebody walked into your classroom, how would they know that you're doing student-centered instruction? Okay? What would indicate that to an observer? Okay? And here they are again, further explained, and if you need them further explained, they are in the notes. I didn't make copies of those for everybody here, but you can pull them up on the app if you can't see this as well. Those of you in virtual land, you can pull them up on the app in the notes. Okay? All right, let's take about 3 minutes to do that. To have it, think about it, and pick just one characteristic with your discussion pair.
Just want to know when you'd like to answer those virtual questions.
We have questions?
One right now. Yeah.
Okay. We'll go to that now.
But about that, I think for collaboration, like your group learning, group discussion, rigor, I'm still trying to get there. So.
Oh,
As
okay.
they go, would that work when they have, discussion time?
Okay, look at me. Thank you. Someone remembered. Very good. You get a star. Let's try it one more time. Look at me. Okay, and that means that you can finish off your sentence, whoever's speaking at that time, and then be ready for what's going to come next. Okay. So we jumped into culturally responsive teaching very quickly. And you had minimal resources actually available to you unless you were, like some folks, pulling it up on the app and having at least one person at the table with the laptop open so that you could see the particular principles. What I'd like you to do now is to begin the process of creating your group's concept map. Now, a question from the virtual sites is, can we have a concept map? Actually, you're going to create your own concept map. Find yourself a blank sheet of paper. Big one would be great. And begin the process of thinking about how you're going to organize the information as a pair, as a group, or even as an individual that we're going to go through and discuss this morning. And this is the first piece, the concept map. Excuse me. It'd be just the idea of culturally responsive teaching. How are you going to represent that in your concept map? And you have the paper in front of you, there are markers, and you can begin that process now, thinking about, you could create a tree, you could create a Venn diagram, you could create some kind of organizing chart that has UDL and culturally responsive teaching in the middle and lots of circles and triangles and squares around the outside. You people are far more creative than I am, frankly, so I'm sure that we'll have lots of different creative examples of concept maps by the end of this morning, okay? So take about 3 minutes to begin the process of creating your concept map, specifically focusing on what you discussed and what you think you understand about culturally responsive teaching right now. Oh, no, thanks. I just spilled the coffee down in front of me. So I think I'll stop drinking that. Great. Look at this. Okay. Yes. The other one that has the explanation? Yes, yes. I'll be right back.
Oh, actually, she has a microphone. I'll just take it.
Okay.
This one will be
One, or pick a summary. What we're going to be doing when we do the concept map is summarizing a chunk of the discussion and then moving on to the next concept. So if you can summarize something that you discussed around culturally responsive teaching and then represent it on the sheet of paper. And you're going to keep adding to it during the morning. Right. Does that make more sense? Yes. Okay, thanks. Okay. Yeah. With your concept map. You're going to summarize your discussion or your thoughts at this point in time about culturally responsive teaching and represent that on the concept map. Then we're going to move on to another concept and another concept and another concept. And you'll be adding to the map as we go through the morning. Does that help? Okay, thanks. Okay? Whatever you discuss, sort of a summary of what about culturally responsive teaching. Okay? those folks that, particularly in the virtual sites, that are have some questions about how to do this. A concept map can be anything that you want it to be. It can be a ladder. It can be a circle with a bunch of spokes coming out of it, as I've attempted to demonstrate in this slide. It could be a tree. It could be some other kind of structure. And all you need to do is to be able to figure out how you're going to connect those. You're going to connect them with lines. You're going to connect them with arrows. I mean, what works for you? And that's really the idea behind creating a concept map. And you can use your creativity. It does not have to follow any particular pattern. Whatever works for you. Okay. All right, go back to your work. I'm sorry to have interrupted you. This is fabulous. That's great. Okay. Okay. All right, everybody's got something started. That's good.
I'm one of those students that didn't pay attention to, so I was wondering if you could please repeat the instructions.
All you need to do at this point in time is kind of make a determination as a group what your structure is going to be. Okay. And then just summarize what you might have discussed or what you understand to be culturally responsive teaching. One aspect of culturally responsive teaching. All right?
Using these principles.
Using those principles, yeah.
Not
Okay.
these.
Not that. That's something else.
All right.
Okay. Okay. How we doing? Okay.
When we're doing making bacon it takes up a lot more room. There's not as much room for other tasks. Things are moving rather quickly here.
Okay. Look at me. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Good. All right. Let's move on. And this will actually, as we move on this morning, you'll get a more complete idea of what we're trying to create here this morning together. Most of you said that you knew something about universal design for learning. That's the other big concept revolving around culturally responsive design for English learners. And universal design for learning, as you probably know, is a conceptual framework that's built on neuroscience. And it really addresses how our brain works during instruction, during learning, in a learning environment, any of those aspects. There are 3 principles that align with 3 networks that are present in every human brain. The first on this particular chart, and for those of you who have the app, you can download these UDL guidelines, or you can pull them up on a screen so that you can see them better than you might be able to see them here on this slide. And at any rate, the first principle is the principle of providing multiple means of engagement. And that's associated with the center core of our brain that controls our affective networks. Those networks that are all about emotion and interest and sustaining attention, regulating our own learning. That's what the principle of engagement does. It allows us to address how our students, how our learners are using their affective networks in a learning environment. As you look at the UDL guidelines, there are the principles at the top, underneath those brains, and then you have three bolded sections under each of the principles. Those are the guidelines. The other areas that are just kind of bulleted, those are checkpoints, and they come from research that neuroscientists and learning scientists have done over the years, that these are good ideas, recommendations for how you might be able to provide options for recruiting interest or provide options for self-regulation for a learner. So that's how it's organized. The other second principle here, second column, is the principle of providing multiple means of representation. Most of us as educators are pretty familiar with that. We've for a long time been told that we need to provide visual and auditory and tactile kinesthetic, that our learners learn different ways. There's lots of learner variability in the groups that we have. So the principle of representation is associated with those sections in the brain, those networks, neural networks in the brain that are towards the back of the brain, that perceive information, perceive stimuli in the environment, that interpret it, that assign meaning to it, and store it long-term for use in a comprehensible way at another time. It's really about comprehension, starting first from just perceiving and identifying information in our environment to comprehending it at a deep level. And then the third principle, providing multiple means of action and expression, is really associated with our strategic networks in the brain. And those networks originate at the front part of the brain. They're all about planning and expression. So as we plan our learning, as we strategically express ourselves, as we act on the environment to show others what we know and what we're able to do, we're activating our strategic networks. And UDL suggests that you provide multiple means of action and expression as you do that. One other thing that a lot of times people don't realize, those of you who were at the keynote yesterday, Jose talked about the idea that these guidelines are built from the bottom up. And they're organized in that way to help us as educators to organize our planning, frankly. The ones at the bottom row are all about access, accessing information. Then the ones in the middle, all across, are about how you take that information and, me as a speech and language pathologist, I would say process it. You know, how you would integrate it into what you already know using prior knowledge, how you would assign meaning to it, being able to understand the difference between vocabulary or symbols. And then those at the top are really about what some people refer to as higher order thinking, but it's really taking the information that you now hold and understand and understanding it to a level where it's deep comprehension and you can use it, you can transfer it, you can generalize it, you can use it in another situation. It's yours. And you understand it so well that you can strategically plan your own learning using your executive functions, which is the last piece there. At the top over here, under action and expression, providing options for executive functions. Those functions in the brain that have to do with working memory and strategic planning. not building buildings, strategic planning, or city planning, but planning learning. The whole purpose of universal design for learning is to create what we call expert learners. And anybody can be an expert learner. Doesn't matter how you might score an IQ test. Has nothing to do with it. What it has to do with being an expert learner is that you are resourceful, motivated learners, that you are knowledgeable learners, and that you are strategic and goal-oriented in your learning. Then you're an expert learner. And I would guess that everybody in this room is an expert learner. That's why we became teachers. Learning was something we did. We might not have done it well, but we did it. We knew how to do it. And now we're attempting to teach our students using what we know about the learning process. So that's a very brief description of what universal design for learning is. Any clarifying questions on that? Okay. Couple of concepts that are associated with that is the piece saying provide multiple means. By providing multiple means, you're providing options and choice. You're providing flexibility in your planning. You're not having all the students do it the same way, which is one of the reasons why I didn't give you a format to fill out for your concept maps. I want you to create that on your own, knowing what you know and using the skills that you have, giving you choice and flexibility. And I know that you do that with your own students as well. Second part of the concept map now represent what your current thinking about universal design for learning is, given my description and what you already know, what you came here with, and represent that in a summary kind of way on your concept map. Any questions? Okay, let's take about 3 or 4 minutes to do that. Great.
We have one, I mean, those are the
Are they not
shapes.
very
They're all
good?
No, they're shapes. You can't write with them.
The shape.
Bats
Yeah,
and
they're
lightning bolts and things like that.
Okay, yeah, let's get you.
Could we have one other color that's a,
Absolutely.
just one more color is fine.
Whatever. There you go. Okay.
Do the 3. Sorry, I'm listening to them too. So especially the engagement piece, I think is going to be very.
That's fabulous. Yes. Great, great, great. Very good. I love it.
I don't like writing.
this is the most recent, right? Okay. Thank you. Are they all coming from the same site? Sounds like
Yeah. I think it's and I think that falls kind of under strategic in some ways, doesn't it? Like resourceful, you're resourceful. No.
Look at me. Let's try that one more time. Look at me.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, I'm seeing some fabulous concepts for concept maps in the room, and just for the folks who are in virtual sites to explain that and to share that with them, we have one group that's created an umbrella, and they're putting their concepts under the umbrella of culturally responsive design. That's one way to do it. Another group that has a picture of, I think that's a learner? Yeah. Yes. It could be a teacher, a human, and they're putting the concepts that we're covering and talking and discussing at different parts of the body, all right? And just some words to describe culturally responsive teaching, words to describe universal design for learning. We've got another group that's creating what looks to me like a ladder, where they're putting the concepts up on each of the rungs of the ladder. Other groups that have circles, centric circles and circles around, and circles that aren't yet connected, but they're in different places on the paper waiting for that connection, right? So those are the kinds of ideas that have come forward with the group here. Those of you in the virtual sites, hopefully you're able to just put down on paper in whatever way works for you, even if you have to do it as an individual as opposed to in a group, a way to summarize each of the blocks that we're going to be talking about this morning. And let me tell you why I'm doing this. Research shows, it's something for you to think about as you're planning lessons. Research shows that if you give learners at least 30 seconds to a minute to synthesize a concept that you've just talked about, a big idea, an important point that you want them to remember, they will perform 40% better than if you don't do that on a final assessment. So each one of the times that I ask you to go and create something on your concept map, the purpose of that is to help you to just take a moment to reflect on what we just talked about, maybe talk with a peer, and synthesize it for yourself so that you can move it from working memory to your short-term memory and hopefully to your long-term memory, and remember it when you leave this room at 10 o'clock. That's the purpose of doing this, and hopefully that helps the questions that folks have in the virtual sites. Okay, let's, excuse me, let's move on. So I worked at CAST for a number of years, as you heard in the description, and did a lot of, workshops explaining what universal design for learning was, having people experience it, experience their recognition networks and their strategic networks and, and all of that good stuff. And invariably, somebody by the end of the session would say, okay, I get it. Now what? How do I do this thing? And that caused me to write this book, Your UDL Lesson Planner, because I realized two things. One, we weren't really telling people or helping people to understand a process they could use. to apply UDL. And two, a lot of people don't really understand how to create effective lessons. They've been taught maybe a method in their method classes, but that doesn't hold for every group of learners. And so what I attempted to do in this book was to combine my understanding of universal design for learning with my understanding and what the research said about what's an effective way to plan a lesson. And that's what we're going to be talking about now. So I created basically 6 steps. I'm a very organized person. I live in an abstract random world. But I try very hard to be organized, and so having something in a step-by-step way helps me. And so the first step in designing a lesson is looking at goals, like we talked about earlier. And when you're talking about goals for culturally diverse groups, in particular English learners, it's important to keep in mind that you need to look both at the content as well as the language that you expect during that lesson. And those of you who are working as coaches and teachers on special assignment, doing instruction with other educators, those of you who are administrators and coordinators who have the opportunity to influence what other people do, this is a really important concept that everybody in the school, everybody in the program needs to work on language, in addition to the academics. And that they should be thinking as they're planning their lessons, what language is required during this lesson? And then also, what's the academic content that's required for this lesson? What do I want them to know or be able to do? Another really key point in the research is if your learners can articulate the learning goal, and preschoolers can do that, frankly. They can tell you, what are you supposed to do here? What are we working on? They can tell you. I worked with preschoolers for 25 years, and they can do it. Even when they're nonverbal, they can tell you. So making sure that they know what the goals are. It's not a guessing game. They need to know what the goals are so that they can integrate that and design some personal goals for themselves. And the last point on here is, frankly, that we need to maintain high expectations for all learners. I know that there are some people who believe that you, and they suggest that you should design certain goals for kids who have IEPs and other goals for kids who are English learners and other goals for everybody else. I don't ascribe to that. I believe you maintain a high expectation for all learners, and then you meet their needs by adding flexibility, choice, and scaffolds to your lessons. And that's how you help them to meet the goals. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Any questions on that? Okay. So in the book, I talk about creating flexible, smart learning goals. Have you guys learned about SMART goals, what they are? Specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound? Okay, I'm not going to go over that because most people, especially if you've got a special ed background, most people kind of know that. If you want to know more about what that is, buy the book. Because I go into it quite extensively in the book. But the key piece in all of that is think about the verb you use when you write your goal. If you use a verb that is restrictive in nature, in that there's only one way that the learners are going to be able to show you what they know or what they've learned, then you're automatically putting up barriers for some of the learners in your class. So make sure that you, rather than, if you're not working on writing, don't develop a goal that says you're going to write an essay about the Civil War. If your idea is that they understand the rationale behind why the North and South went to war, then write a goal that allows you, with a flexible verb like develop or compose or express, so a word like that, that allows them multiple ways of showing you that they understand the rationales that the North and South used, as an example. In the book, I actually go through and give you lots of suggestions based on, you use Common Core here in California, right? Based on the Common Core. Here's a preschool goal. This is what I consider to be a flexible, smart goal. It may seem like it's way too long for you. That's okay. It's a place to start. You can always cut back, right? But a preschool goal, birth to 5, with prompting as needed. That's your scaffold. Students will recall key details from a familiar nursery rhyme to answer 4 out of 5 who and what questions. Very specific, very measurable. Okay? And yet, it's flexible. They can show you different ways how they can do that. Name a content area. Someone in the room. ELA? English language? Okay. English language arts? Middle school, high school, or elementary? Middle school. Okay. Here's a middle school smart, flexible goal. Students will analyze how Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, uses descriptive words and phrases to create a theme of urgency and speed, and express their conclusions, at least at the proficient level, as measured by a presentation rubric. In other words, they're going to do a presentation. You're going to use a rubric to assess that. And then it defines in a short 3-minute presentation using media. Lots of pieces there, lots of flexibility. And the verb is that they'll use descriptive words. They can use descriptive words, and that they will analyze. Analyze is a very flexible verb. So you've got verbs there that almost every student in the classroom should be able to show you how they can do that. All right, how about another one more? Maybe social studies, high school? Okay. Social studies. Using information from our text and secondary sources, students will record data on world maps to track the spread of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, as it was carried westward from Asia to Africa and Europe. And then it's at a proficient or higher level as measured by a rubric and mapping skills. So again, I really do use a lot of rubrics. I use all rubrics in my teaching at George Washington University. I never give tests, which I'm sure the students really like. But, but rubrics actually is a way to express what the expectations are to the learner, and it gives you a way of providing feedback in a very concrete way. If you're looking for a source on rubrics, Susan Brookhart wrote a great book on how to develop rubrics for any content area, Susan Brookhart. So those are some examples of how you can write flexible goals and incorporate scaffolds into them so that your learners can achieve them. Okay, and let's just talk briefly about scaffolds. Remember that scaffolds are temporary in nature. They're not accommodations. Accommodations are permanent in nature. If you've got kids with IEPs and it says a kid needs to have extra time as his or her accommodation, you have to provide that by law. Scaffolds, it's your choice how you provide those, when you provide those, what you provide. And so scaffolds are temporary Temporary in a couple of ways. One, you can take them away when the students don't need them. Also, you can offer them as a choice. And frankly, what most educators have found is that students will choose not to use a scaffold in order to challenge themselves. But those students who you might not think need a scaffold will go and use that scaffold. You know, whether it's a Venn diagram to organize the information for themselves, schematic mapping, fill in the line sentence starter for them as they're writing a paragraph, for example. You know, any kind of scaffold that you might put in place. On the slide are some common scaffolds used for English learners. Having bilingual word walls. We all have word walls, usually, particularly at the elementary, maybe middle school level. But if you have a common second language in your classroom, making it bilingual, particularly at the high school, middle school, and high school level, where those students might actually have some literacy skills in their first language, would be a great way, even if you don't put it on the wall, if you provide it on a sheet of paper or something else that would be available to them, be a great way for them to scaffold their learning, and it's invisible to the rest of the classroom. But all of these, Realia, using real objects for younger children in particular, using the first language, using a first language peer, these are all scaffolds that you can incorporate into your language goals. As an example, product templates, providing a model, those are all scaffolds. Questions? Yes? Okay. The question was, can you give an example of a culturally based example? Well, you're going to see a video later that shows an elementary teacher who's talking to her students about a book that's written about how to make tortillas. She has primarily Spanish-speaking students in her class. It's very culturally relevant to them. They know what tortillas are. It's not a hard word for them. So it's a culturally based example. It's a culturally based text for them. Other kinds of examples might be in not just dealing with that first level of culture where we talk about food and holidays and whatnot, but actually going down and talking more about beliefs and symbols, using those as examples for students so that it's acceptable. Even if you're doing something about the Civil War, maybe a culturally responsive example would be, well, let's also think about what happened to the Chinese that were here during the Civil War. How did this affect them, this situation? Were they involved in it in any way? You know, so if you have a large population or a group of Chinese students in your classroom. That's sort of what I would think of. Does anybody have another example? Okay. Yes?
Would it not also be a culturally based example? I was in one of the workshops where they were doing a problem about, and they discussed city blocks, and the student was thinking of building blocks, and I felt like it should have had a culturally based example showing pictures of city blocks, because that was not within the student's experience and they did not know what the teacher was talking about.
Great example, yes. Using actual pictures of a city block to make sure that students understood that you're not talking about Lego blocks. Right, great example. Thank you. Okay, so let's see where we are here. Okay, before we move on now to the next section, where we're going to talk about learner variability, I want you to capture on your concept maps a synthesized idea about what we just discussed in creating flexible, smart learning goals with scaffolds. Okay, take about 3 minutes to do that. Yes, I threw them off because I didn't have a slide. Oh, okay. Right. Look at me. Let's try that again. Look at me. Very good. Okay, that's excellent. All right, we're going to move a little faster during our concept map times for the remainder because we have less than a half an hour left, and I want to make sure that you get to everything and that I get to everything. So the next step in the process, so you've got your goal, and it's flexible, and you've thought about what scaffolds you might need, looking at the lesson, looking at the task. Where are the barriers? What scaffolds might I need, either based on my students and their abilities and prior knowledge, and also based on what the expectations are of that particular lesson, what the task is that they're going to do. Also then, it's helpful to take a really close look at learner variability and what that is and what learner variability might exist within your classroom. Now I'm going to ask you to do something, and I hope that we can do this relatively quickly. And those of you in the virtual sites, if you want to actually get up physically and do this, if you have at least 4 or 5 people in the room, that'd be great. If not, just sit at your tables and have a discussion about this. That's fine too. But folks here, what I want you to do is to locate yourself based on which one of these descriptions best matches you. Are you a person who speaks only English? You've never learned another language? That's it. And if you are a person who speaks only English, I want you to go to that corner. If you are a person who learned a second language by the time you were 18, but you kind of forgot it, like me, you can't speak it fluently, come over here to this part. If you are a person who learned a second language by the time you were 18, and you speak at least 2 languages, English and that other language, or maybe even more fluently, then go to this space right here. Okay? And if you are a person who speaks several languages fluently, go to that space over there. And when you get to that space, talk about how your description, being a monolinguistic person, a bilingual or multilingual person, how that contributes to yourself, your funds of knowledge as a teacher, and yourself in terms of your own sense of self as a learner. Any question about what you're going to be doing? Okay, let's move then. Ones, 2s, 3s right here, and 4s back there. And speak quickly with each other about, your reactions. You might want to make smaller groups so that everybody has a chance to talk, and just kind of share with each other how your description means something different for you as a person and a teacher. Okay? Okay. Maybe we could make a couple smaller groups here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So how many languages do you speak?
So I grew up with 3 dialects in the Philippines, and then
Of course.
in English, and then I took a lot of French in middle school and high school. I'm not fluent in French, but
You speak Tagalog?
I do. I speak Tagalog, Ilocano, and Scaffolds.
That's impressive. And you?
Actually, I grew up in a home with Spanish and Chinese. Learned English at school, and then ASL.
And ESL too. Wow. That's that's impressive. Covered the mic while I was talking to the group back there. I'll try not to do that. You might ask him. Okay, I'm going to ask you to finish your conversations and go back, please. I'm going to ask you to finish your conversations and go back to your seats and reflect your conversation on your concept maps. Okay? They're not going to go. This is too much fun. Look at me. Yeah, just stuff. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for everyone to share, but if you could go back to your seats for a moment and reflect on what you heard and what you might have been able to share. Not everybody was able to share in that discussion. So think about how your linguistic capabilities, either as a monolingual person or a multilingual or bilingual person, impacts yourself as a teacher, the funds of knowledge you have as a teacher, your understandings maybe of your learners, and that of your learners, how their experiences, their linguistic capabilities might impact them as learners. And as we move ahead, that's one of the pieces that really makes up the learner variability that exists within your room. Remember, we were looking at the UDL guidelines, and those reflect in any group the kind of variability you're going to find. There's going to be somebody here who needs additional assistance and supports in order to sustain their interest for an hour and a half. And somebody here who has figured out how to do that, and that's not a problem for them. It's not an issue for them. They don't need my help in doing that. There's going to be somebody here who actually has some difficulty with physical movement. And sitting for an hour and a half is a struggle for them. So they've either, and I've seen a couple people get up and move to the back of the room. They've learned to do that so that they can maintain their attention through a session that might be this long. So each learner's brain is developed based on experiences and some innate skills that they might have, and every brain is distinct, right? But the other thing that's interesting about all of that is that because UDL captures all the different ways that we can be distinct in a learning environment, you can use the UDL guidelines in a systematic way to predict the variability that's going to exist during a lesson and plan for it. There is a fabulous video by Dr. Todd Rose called it's on YouTube, called The Myth of the Average. And I strongly encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't seen it already. Some of you have seen it. It's a TED Talk. It's fabulous. And it helps to really clarify what learner variability really is. There's learner variability among the affective networks, so we're going to have students who are going to be very comfortable in our classrooms, and we're going to have students who are like this fellow. They're nervous, they're stressed out, they have a difficulty thinking clearly. There's going to be learner variability among the recognition networks, where some students are going to need extra support in order to be able to understand the content and make meaning out of it. And there's going to be learner variability based on the strategic networks, as particularly an English learner who might have varied backgrounds, might be a newcomer, might be a student who actually has been here their entire life but is first exposed to English when they enter kindergarten or preschool. Very different linguistic backgrounds for those two students, and that makes a difference in terms of how their brains develop and how their strategic networks develop. Using the UDL guidelines will help us define how kids might vary in their learning, and that would be the second step in your lesson planning process. The other idea is this idea of stages of language development. How many of you are familiar with the stages of language development for English learners? Okay, a few. Okay, great, great. There are two systems out there that I know of. The WIDA system that identifies 6 steps, the 6 stages, and this set of stages that was developed by Hill and Miller. I like this set because it defines time, anticipated time that a student might be at a certain stage, and I think that's helpful for us as we're trying to do some thinking about the variability that students might have. You have in your handout a description, brief description, of each one of these stages. And in the book that I wrote with Louis Lord Nelson, Culturally Responsive Design, which has disappeared. What did I do with it? There it is. This one, which was available at the bookstore, Culturally Responsive Design for English Learners, the UDL Approach. We delved down deep into each one of these stages, and we do a crosswalk between the stages and UDL and culturally responsive teaching. But as you can see in the stages, the pre-production or silent reception, the receptive stage, kids are really pretty silent. They only have about maybe 500 words. They rarely speak. They use a lot of gestures. They will respond to yes/no questions. Then the next stage, early production, they may double the number of words that they know, and they're beginning to use some 1- and 2-word sentences. but they're still gesturing and responding with nonverbal ways. When they finally get to speech emergence, and this might take 2 years for some kids, then they're able to use some sentences. They've tripled the number of words that they know, and yet they're still using mistakes in their grammar. It's not perfect. And they have difficulty, just like many of our 7-year-olds have difficulty with abstract and figurative language. They're not there yet. Sarcasm really doesn't work for them quite well. So that's important to keep in mind. Just because you can use sentences doesn't necessarily mean that they understand how you're making a point, particularly if you're using sarcasm. Then they finally get to a place where they're actually able to use the English language for their learning, and that's at that intermediate language proficiency stage and the advanced language proficiency stage. And those 2 stages, they're still making some mistakes, but they're getting close to what their peers might be in terms of verbal production. I want you to take 5, meaning actually we're going to take 4 minutes, and I'm going to show you a description of 3 students. At your tables, identify one of the students, either Sameh, Anna, or Lelitsu, and think about what we talked about with learner variability and language differences, stages of language development. Think about 1 or 2 characteristics that you think might be something you'd observe with this particular student. So you're going to choose Sameh, Lalitsu, or Anna, and the handouts that are on the app show these descriptions. For those of you in the virtual sites, you can pull that up, or hopefully you downloaded it. But here they are. Pick one of these students, and in your group, identify 1 or 2 characteristics that you think might represent the learner variability of this particular student. Any questions on that? And then add it in a conceptual way to your concept map, if you can. If you don't have time for that, that's fine. Okay? 4 minutes for that. So take 5 and list a couple of learner variability characteristics. Oh, I'm so sorry. Of course. their capabilities, the characteristics you'd see in that student, what their learner variability might look like. Okay? One or two. So are you able to come up with at least one or two learner variability characteristics that you think might exist, that you might need to be mindful of for that particular student? Let's move ahead so that we can address the other aspects of lesson planning. I'm going to just, because everybody's engaged, I'm going to give you a couple more seconds. Okay. Okay. Oh, you got quiet all by yourselves. That's great. Okay. So, quick summary. Some takeaways about learner variability in English learners. One is that they're not homogeneous as a group. Just because a student is a newcomer doesn't mean that his or her learner variability is developed the same way as everybody else's. They've had unique histories and backgrounds. And the other thing to keep in mind is that learners who are second language or dual language learners are twice involved. They're doing double duty in your classrooms in that they are learning English at the same time that they're learning academics. And so what might look like boredom, they're yawning, they're tired, they're disinterested, they might put their heads down on the table. It may not be that they've lost interest. It may be that they're just tired, because this is hard work. You know, think about that as a second language learner yourself. If you had the opportunity to learn a second language, it is hard work. So keep that in mind. The third step, yes, ma'am, we have a question. What do you mean by learner variability? Learner variability is the difference that exists within each of us and within any group in terms of your learning skills. And it's really very much related to how the UDL guidelines are designed. Can I steal this a second? If you want to know what learner variability is, scan through this and you will see that there are students in your classroom and many of us here in this room that have strengths and needs in areas here under each one of these guidelines. And so really, that's what learner variability is. It's how our brains are different. That's one of the questions that came. So let's talk quickly about assessment. Assessments should be flexible. They should encourage choice. They should be valid, meaning that you're testing what you purport to be testing. You're testing what you taught them, and they need to be unbiased. Please don't ask kids who've never been to a museum to describe walking through a museum in order to show their writing skills. That's going to be a very biased task for them. So make sure that your examples are unbiased, that your assessments are unbiased in that way. Also, these are what we call classroom assessment techniques, CATs. People use other terms to describe them. They're informal or formative assessments. We've used a couple of them today. Fist of 5 is a good example. Take 5 is another example. Using sign language and different kinds of coding. These are all examples, voting with your feet, all examples of how you can use assessment in your classroom, and think about that proactively as you're designing your lesson. The fourth step, methods, materials, and media. One of my pet peeves is that people move to what method or material they're going to use for a lesson before they've done this other stuff first. And then it doesn't align well, frankly. And they don't really know if they're assessing what the goal, because they haven't really thought about that. But once you get to a point where, okay, I've got a goal, I know how I'm going to assess it, I've considered the learner variability in the classroom, I'm going to now figure out what methods, materials, and media I'm going to use. Well, think about how you have to make the situation, the lesson, meaningful to the student by activating all the different parts of their brain. Starting with getting their attention. You have about two minutes at the beginning to get their attention. And then you've lost them, frankly, as young learners. Make sure everything's accessible, that they can see it, hear it, understand it, make it personally relevant by considering personal goals or some other way to say that this is related to you because it's about your culture or what have you. Make it meaningful, connect it with what they already know, connect it to what they're going to be studying in the future. Make sure they have a chance to apply it, to synthesize it like we were talking about before they leave your room, your classroom, and make it matter by testing it. I'm moving kind of quickly now, and I apologize for that. But I want to make sure we get through all of this. Do you know about tiered vocabulary, most of you? Making sure that as you design your lesson, you also think about whether you're going to need to explain Tier 1 vocabulary to some of your students, Tier 2, Tier 3. And finally, I'm going to show you the beginnings of a lesson. I'm just going to show you a couple minutes of it. While we watch this lesson, I want you to think about the strategies that she uses. Those of you in the virtual sites, you can find this on YouTube. The link is on the slide.
Funding for Common Core State Standards and
just watch the
ELLs
first
is
minute,
provided
and I
by
want
the
you to
American
think about
Federation of Teachers Innovation
how she's
Fund.
using UDL strategies even though she really doesn't know UDL.
You are going to be doing a cooperative paragraph.
Ali Nava is having her second graders work on a cooperative paragraph about the text they're studying, Burros Tortillas.
I'm going to assign you either beginning, middle, or an end. And as a group, you guys need to come up with an exemplary sentence about what happened during each part of the story, whatever your part is.
To begin, she breaks the students into small groups and assigns each group a section of the story to summarize.
You are going to discuss with your group, and you're going to write the same sentence. What happened in either, whatever you're assigned, beginning, middle, or end. And when you're done, we're going to come back and share those out. Does everyone understand that? I don't want to see you just sitting down and starting writing away. You've got to talk to each other to see what you're going to put.
The students then discuss the story and come up with a summary sentence together. As extra guidance, Ms. Nava lets the students reference story flashcards and their previous summary worksheets.
So we should write in the square, the poodle didn't share with the bobcat, jackrabbit, and coyote.
Once the groups have their summary statements ready, Ms. Nava brings everyone together so they can share their work.
I want you to share with me the sentences that you came up with in the little rectangle part. It should be the same sentence. You guys agreed upon it. And
what she does is she goes through and she has them come up and write the sentences. She writes them on the board there on the sheet in front, but she makes purposeful errors, like writing the word said as S-E-D instead of S-A-I-D, and the kids self-correct her. And she talks about how we all make mistakes and that they were able to help her find her mistakes. I hope that you have a chance to watch the entire thing. It's about 5 minutes long. We don't, unfortunately, have enough time to do that today, as we have a couple other things that we want to do. Let me just keep going here. As you're teaching, in the next step, as you're teaching, make sure you're collecting data, you're doing your informal testing, your formative testing, so that there are assessments so you understand whether or not the students actually have learned what you're attempting to teach them. And then the final step is reflecting on your lesson and making sure that you reflect as an expert, that you ask these kinds of questions of yourself and your lesson as you're doing it. Making sure that you think about, in terms of engagement, what might have happened, in terms of representation, what might have happened, and action and expression, what might have happened. And you have those questions. This is a quick summary. I'd like to thank the folks from the virtual site. Everybody else here, stay here for just a moment. We appreciate your participation, and we hope that you were able to meet your personal learning goals. For those of you here, take a look at your concept maps. Think about whether or not you were able to meet your personal learning goals. And are we off now? I want to address